use today could either enshrine, exacerbate, or amplify different impacts on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And they can do it at scale, so affecting larger parts of the society, more people at the same time. And that's why it's also our business. We are not a traditional digital rights organization or tech organization, but we do concern ourselves with enabling environment for civil society and for civic space. This also includes any impact from different tools and technologies that could happen on civic space, be it offline or online. With that regard, we do believe that AI systems should be designed and developed in order to operate in a way that is truly compliant with human rights standards, including civic freedoms at every stage of design, development, assessment, evaluation, auditing, implementation, so the entire cycle. In order to achieve that, of course, AI systems would need to operate within legally framed and institutional construct and space. That includes also some kind of impact assessment, oversight, and enforcement. So some of the questions we are trying to answer is, how are human rights affected by the use of AI systems? How can the human rights framework contribute to the governance and the regulation of AI? And how can individuals and groups access remedies when their rights are affected? Now, these are the questions we need to address as a society in the long term. And we will start today with the first one, the impact of AI systems. If you wish to join us for other consequent workshops that we will do throughout this year, please do follow us on Twitter for announcements on how to register for these workshops. And we'll, of course, send out a round of emails to different networks and groups. See in the chat our Twitter handle if you want to follow us. So without further ado, I will give the screen to our speakers today. We have a really amazing group of people, and they will introduce themselves, their work, and their passion. And they will also guide us through the maze of some of these topics and questions that I mentioned in the introduction. Please, Andrew, it's over to you. Screen is yours.
Great. Hi, everyone. Well, my name is Andrew Strapes. I'm the Associate Director of Research Partnerships here at the Ada Lovelace Institute. Those of us who don't know us, we're a research and delivery body based in London with a mission to ensure that data and AI work for people and society. And a lot of our work is focused on studying the social and technical implications of various forms of algorithmic systems used in public and private sector. My background as well is that I come from industry. So I used to work on a team who was responsible for trying to implement ethics processes at a large organization many of you may know called Google. And my background is also in content moderation. For many years, I was a content moderator and a policy specialist working on content moderation issues there. Today, I'd like to start us off in this brief conversation with describing 4 key challenges that I think AI poses for human rights, rule of law, and democracy. And I want to flag these are not the only 4 challenges that AI poses, but there are 4 key ones that I think will help elucidate some of the discussion we'll have later throughout the day. In this conversation, I also want to give a broad sense of how AI systems are developed, because I think that's a good way to visualize the different ways and different moments where an intervention can take place to help mitigate the kinds of harms and impacts of these systems on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. So before we go any further, I think it's good to add some context that we are witnessing an enormous shift in the datafication of essential parts of our lives. An enormous amount of data is produced every second about ourselves, and that amount is only increasing year on year. And worryingly, it's not just data from social media or applications on our phone, it's forms of data about your personal life, your health, your finances, your identity, and even those around you. We're being categorized, tracked, monitored, and quantified like never before in human history. And a major reason why we're seeing this rush to datafy as many parts of our lives as we can is this notion of trying to augment or replace human decision-making for the sake of convenience in many parts of our day-to-day lives. Now, AI systems run on data. AI broadly refers to systems that display some kind of intelligent behavior. And AI systems often rely on algorithms, which broadly refers to a set of rules or instructions that a computer can follow. A good metaphor for thinking of an algorithm is a recipe for cooking. It gives you a set of instructions to use specific data, the ingredients, to create a particular outcome, the dish. But a more precise term for many of the systems that we're concerned with is an algorithmic decision-making system. These are tools and technologies that seek to aid or replace human decision-making. Some common examples that I'm sure many of you are familiar with include systems that automatically identify and flag hate speech on social media platforms, scan CVs and resumes to predict the likely successful candidates in an application for a job, and systems that predict the likelihood of success or failure of a loan application. A key point that I want to really drive home throughout our conversation is that it really is less important about the technical details of a system and more important what the impacts of that system are on you and those around you. Whether it's a very powerful machine learning system or a very simple statistical model, or even just a spreadsheet, the less important question is what the details of that system are, and the more important one is how is that affecting those around you and other affected communities of that system. I want to briefly touch on how an AI system is developed, because I think this can give us some good insight into some of the early stages of intervention that could have impacts for human rights, rule of law, and democracy. So we can use, for a hypothetical system that does resume scanning. It claims to automatically evaluate a resume and assess if a candidate is a successful or unsuccessful hire before they've even gone into an interview. There's two general processes that we'll talk about. The first is a training process, where data is collected and then run through an algorithm. The data in this case might be previous CVs and resumes from other jobs from successful and unsuccessful candidates. And the algorithm that's running on this might be weighting certain features of those applications or those CVs over others. For example, the grades that were on those resumes that were successful versus not, or the schools that they attended versus the ones that were not. That creates a trained system that can now be run on new input data. So let's say it's your resume, you're applying for a role. It's run through this trained system, which scans for the different criteria and renders a decision to hire or not hire. And in many of these systems, that decision is then fed back into the training data, which forms a feedback loop. Now, there may be humans who inspect various parts of this process. That decision may go to a human HR professional to make an assessment. But in some cases, if it's a very large firm and there's a lot of applicants, there may be no human involved in that decision at all. It may just be going off of whatever the system decides is a good or bad score. I want to zoom out for a minute, though, to focus on the fact that that stage we just talked about, that development stage, is just one part of a much broader life cycle around the integration of an AI system. If we go back further, we can see that these products are reliant on existing research from academic and corporate communities to develop those systems. They're reliant on private and public funders like venture capital firms, research agencies, government funds, which set an incentive for an organization's development and business model. What kinds of clients will they serve? What kinds of problems will their products seek to address? And how are those problems being framed? For example, if the product is supposed to be a tool that helps assess visa applications, is the problem being framed as a tool that will help make the visa process easier for applicants, or to help remove unwanted individuals from the visa application pool? Many systems are developed and sold onto a third party, which creates power imbalances, where the client of a system often may have no access to the data, code, or understanding of how a system they're using operates. In the case of the CV and resume hiring case, many large employers outsource that or purchase that system from a third party. They have no control over the data that it's being trained on or access to the code to contest any of those decisions. I flag this point because some kinds of harms and implications that AI pose aren't just about the product or the system itself. We often have to look holistically at the kinds of incentives that are driving certain applications and how they are integrated into complex social systems if we're going to fully understand the implications for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Now, I want to flag these 4 key challenges, which I think fit across that life cycle. The first is this notion that there's a very short duration between the research, AI research, and the productization of that research. AI systems don't really require much resources to build in many cases. Large data sets are available online for anyone to play with, and access to code and compute required to train a system is relatively easy to come by. This makes the barrier for harmful outcomes much lower than other technologies like biotechnology, which require significant investments in access to hardware like wet labs in order to create new technologies. It also makes anticipating harms harder and makes regulation and oversight more difficult. And to give an example of this in practice, deepfakes, these hyper-realistic images and video, the underlying technology for that only came out in 2014 in a research paper. But by 2017, only 3 years later, we were seeing it widely used in gendered sexual harassment campaigns against women worldwide. A second challenge is this notion that AI systems can often make opaque processes more opaque, which makes contesting those systems extremely challenging, let alone even knowing when they're in operation. That makes a challenge for understanding the impacts on human rights or the rule of law. If we don't even know if a system is being operated, how are we supposed to assess it, to monitor it? A good example of this is the Home Office visa algorithm. This was a system that took information provided by visa applicants and automatically processed it in the UK. It gave each person a color code based on a traffic light system of green, amber, or red. And one metric used was nationality. The legal agency Foxglove, which challenged this algorithm in court, alleged that the Home Office kept a secret list of suspected nationalities, which would automatically be denied a visa. You can see similar stories in other high-stakes settings like child social care algorithms, which determine the risk of a child in a care home setting. Or to take another case from the UK Home Office, a sham marriage algorithm, which was found to be racially biased. It would assess marriages and try to determine if they were likely done for visa purposes or for other purposes that appear to be unlawful. There's a challenge here that when you don't have access to those decisions and no way to contest or challenge those decisions, it can make already opaque processes that are deeply entrenched in our society even more complex and challenging to monitor and address. A third challenge is that AI systems can operate at extreme scale and speed, which exacerbates the risks of human rights harms and implications for the rule of law. Law cannot keep up. It is a blunt tool. And many of the AI systems that we are talking about are integrated without much consideration beforehand as to their impacts and risks. Rare is it that affected communities are consulted by developers of these systems before they're implemented. Even rarer are the cases in which developers are working and actively partnering with affected communities to develop tools that serve their needs. This is particularly true in large-scale platforms like social media platforms, which are multinational and global in scale. It means that tools don't translate well from one context to another. To give an example, Facebook launched a hate speech algorithm that was trying to capture known instances of hate speech across its platform. But unfortunately, it also began in 2018 to capture ads for LGBTQ events. Their filters flagged anything relating to the word gay as being potentially unsafe or for children or politically sensitive. And this was largely because people were feeding in data from all different parts of the world into that system, which often meant that it didn't really have a very nuanced approach to very specific applications. It couldn't tell if someone was using the word gay in a positive way or in a derogatory way. And we're seeing that happen actually this week. A report just came out a few days ago showing that Twitter and Instagram's hate speech filters are censoring content about Palestine and Sheikh Jarrah, being unable to determine if these are posts that are inflammatory and hateful, or if they're posts about actual news coverage or responses to the crisis occurring there. The speed and scale at which these systems are developed makes monitoring them and understanding those impacts extremely difficult. That's one of the many, many challenges I think we see when we talk about these systems being deployed, particularly at large-scale settings like social media. And a fourth challenge that I want to flag is the notion that these systems are dynamic and they learn from historic data. And that means that even with positive intentions, they can still cause harm, even if a system passes muster in lab settings. If an impact assessment is run in lab settings, that system can still cause harm when it's put in use in the real world, trained on other real world data. A very disturbing example of this was a 2019 report about an algorithm that was used in hundreds of hospitals across the United States that gave patients a risk score for needing additional treatment. The algorithm's data focused particularly on the annual total healthcare costs accrued in a year of different patients. But but if you look at the sort of the nature of that data, there's some underlying systemic bias and racism inherent in it. In the United States, the average Black American spends far less on healthcare per year than a white American for numerous reasons, in part due to existing income inequalities that are rooted in systemic in the United States, but also relating to levels of distrust of the healthcare system and direct racial discrimination by healthcare providers. So while the system appeared fair when it was developed, when it was deployed in real world data, it quickly developed a very biased outcome. Black patients had to be sicker than white patients before being referred for additional help. Only 17% of patients that the algorithm assigned to receive extra care were Black, when that number should have been about 50%. This example also highlights another related challenge that even with a human doctor in the loop reviewing a decision, an algorithm can still affect human judgment. We call this algorithmic bias. The system's suggestion that a patient didn't need further treatment ultimately affected their referral, and this ended up affecting millions of Black Americans until it was caught. So I want to leave you with some final thoughts, and just in fact, one real big one. We've walked through some of the key challenges that these systems can pose for AI democracy, or sorry, for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And I've also walked through some of the ways in which these systems are developed and integrated, those moments and parts of a different development process where an intervention could apply. And one thing I'd really love to discuss in the breakouts and in the discussion Q&A is what safeguards and mechanisms we can implement to address these challenges. I think we're talking about, in many ways, some types of technologies that pose unique challenges that require unique solutions to address. But some existing mechanisms that you already use in your day-to-day work may well be suited to mitigate some of these harms. I want to thank you so much again, and I'll now pass it back to Vanya. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Really excellent overview. And of course, the key question in the end that we are all looking answer for. I'll pass it immediately to Orem, our next speaker, but just a reminder to everyone, feel free to post your questions in the chat for our speakers. Orem, the floor is yours.
Hello, I am Orem. I use they, them pronouns, and I was born and raised on the occupied land of the Napi Nation, also known as New York City. I apologize in advance for the background noise because there is a lot of construction happening. Visually, I am a white and Asian non-binary femme with light olive skin. I am wearing a green button down and a green blazer. I am seated in front of a bookshelf filled with books on technology, philosophy, anti-racism, decolonization, and narratives of liberation, and also my art supplies. I worked in technology for many years, and I ended up leaving because there were far too many times where I did not have the language or the research to speak out on what I inherently felt was wrong in the tech industry. So I went into research and I found myself in digital rights spaces. I noticed though that there was still this lack of depth to the conversation when we were talking about fairness, accountability, and transparency of algorithms. Through my research, I realized that it was really a lack of understanding of systems of oppression, racism, and colonialism. And that is why I'm very excited to be here today speaking to all of you. I truly believe that you all bring the necessary expertise, experiences, and work into the conversations that are happening, and we really need you. So before I get into it, I will tell you a bit about what I'll be covering. So I'm going to spend some time establishing a shared language. So I am completely sure already that all of you know far more than me about decolonizing and anti-racism work. So I'm not going to spend too much time on defining those terms, but I still included it because I really build off of those definitions to form my critique of technology and the role it plays in oppression. So after the background info and ensuring that we have a shared language, then I'll share some high-level examples of algorithmic injustice. And finally, I end with what my vision for the future of technology is. And I invite you all to build on it, or even better, create your own vision with your own expertise, because whether you know it or not yet, you all are already experts on this topic. You just need the technological language to express it. So I hope that this talk helps you recognize that within yourself and contextualize technology within your own work. So let's start at the beginning. What is technology? Let's really define it. I define technology as not only an industry, but a tool that has transformed every other industry. And today we're talking about AI. But as Andrew mentioned, what we're really talking about, though, is machine learning, which is one type of AI. And within that, what I'm really talking about in this talk is machines that make decisions. So I want to start off with the context of how human decision-making has developed over time. So we started with carrying out the will of a divine entity to a shift where many humans found power in making their own decisions. And another shift is happening today, this time to algorithms. But these algorithms don't exist outside of structures and systems of oppression. Technology is a tool, and we can expand this definition of technology through exploring what it means for technology to be a tool. Tools get their meaning from the context that they're used in. And the example that I like to use is a hammer. A hammer can be constructive. It could be used to build a house, or it could be destructive. It could be used to destroy a house. And the level of damage that a hammer can do is far, far less than the damage that technology can and has done. But I'm saying this all to demonstrate that technology exists in a social and political context that it cannot be meaningfully separated from. And that context is colonialism, racism, and systems of oppression. So very quickly, I will go through quick definitions of colonization and racism, and then we'll move on. I'm going to read directly because there's this quote from Kixala Carson that I really love on colonization. So colonization is when a small group of people impose their practices, norms, and values. They take away resources and capacity from Indigenous people, often through extreme violence and trauma. Colonizers bring their axiology, which is how things are quantified and how value and worth are prescribed to things. They impose their assessment on the value of the people, resources, and land that then become embedded in the institution that then creates the nation state and settler colonialism. All of the established laws, policies, institutions, and governance structures are based on those beliefs that were brought upon contact. Colonial beliefs also influence epistemology, how we conceive and transfer knowledge, as well as what knowledge we see as credible and valid. This goes for ontology too, which is how we exist within these structures, and how we interpret reality is all deeply influenced by colonization. Axiology, epistemology, and ontology come together to create a narrative of how normal is defined, end quote. And we see colonization manifesting in our day-to-day lives, whether it's us occupying territories without invitation or permission, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, people living without access to clean drinking water, resource extraction, and most recently, the illegal settlements, ethnic cleansing, and state-sanctioned violence against Palestine. And I'll be quoting Soul Factory here. This demonstrates very clearly that colonization is not abstract. It is material and it is violent. Decolonization is not a metaphor. It is a collective act of resistance. And from there, I'll move to defining racism. And I'm not going to fully define racism because I'm sure you all already know. So I'm just going to talk about the ideological and institutional manifestations of racism. So the system of racism is based on a delusional idea that one group is somehow better than the other, and in some measure has the right to control the other group. This delusional idea has been embedded in institutions, structures, beliefs, practices, and the narratives of society. that becomes embedded in the laws, the legal system and police practice, the education system and schools, hiring policies, public policies, housing development, media images, political power, medical treatment, economic power, and political systems. Both decolonization and anti-racism ultimately require the overturning of the colonial and racist structures. It's not about tweaking the existing system to make it a little less oppressive. The existing system is fundamentally and irreparably flawed. So now that I've set the context, now we're going to return to the topic of technology. And basically, I want to introduce this idea that technology is designed, developed, and deployed within the context of racism, colonialism, and systems of oppression. Therefore, it cannot be meaningfully separated from these systems that we are immersed in. And Andrew mentioned a lot of examples, and I'll just add on to that. It looks like risk assessment algorithms like Compass and Siri deciding whether someone goes to prison or not, or whether they can get out on parole. It looks like lie detector algorithms used in immigration agencies. It looks like child welfare services using algorithms to decide who is deemed worthy of parenting their child. And all of these algorithms are biased, in the words of Virginia Eubanks, against people of color, migrants, unpopular religious groups, sexual minorities, and other oppressed groups. And not only is technology a tool designed, developed, and deployed within this context, it's a tool to enact dominance. Oppression is automated through the infrastructure of technology. And seen from this perspective, it's clear that the system is not broken. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Technology is only one tool in a multi-dimensional experience of systems of oppression. And typically in digital rights spaces, from my experiences and in tech spaces, there is a hyper focus on challenging the technology system itself. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't focus on tech, we absolutely should, but we really need to take these actions from the understanding that these technologies are only a symptom, not the root cause. And that is why I believe that all of you are the ones who should be leading the long-term strategies in this space, because you have the deepest understanding of racism, colonialism, and systems of oppression. And I know learning artificial intelligence and machine learning can feel extremely overwhelming, but please remember that you are already an expert on this. You have such a rich and deep understanding of the context of technology. And I 100% believe in my heart you have a better understanding of it than I do. You understand the social and political consequences of technology and the social political consequences of systems of oppression. And technology is just another tool of dominance used by those systems. So I know I'm at time, and I'll end my talk with sharing my vision for the future. And that is that tech should no longer be used as a tool for domination, but rather a tool for facilitating healing, justice, and liberation. Thank you so very much for showing up today. And all of you have an open invitation to reach out to me through email to continue the conversation. Whatever support you need, if it's within my capacity, I will try to do it for you. And you can stay connected to me on LinkedIn and Twitter. And with that, I'll hand it off to the next speaker as we get the slides back up. Marlene, you can start. So when we're challenging technology systems as a way of challenging the underlying oppressive system, it's crucial that we understand how technology is being used in that context. So in other words, these systems have to be transparent, and Marlena will take it from here. Thank you. You're on mute.
Okay, does this work now? Great. I will share Orem's information. Yes, and remind me to never go last after such stellar presentations as my friends and colleagues, Andrew and Orem, because nothing I can say now can top this. So thank you so much to both of you for participating in this event. And I'm glad to be here to present ECNL. And we'll try to bring home some of the key topics that Andrew and Orem raised. And this will really look at talking about how transparency, stakeholder engagement, and accountability today in the AI world are fundamentally lacking. We talk about AI accountability or justice when really there is no accountability, and it's a systematic environment of injustice. And I come to this topic from the human rights field. I'm a human rights lawyer focusing primarily on corporate accountability, or lack of, I should say. And that's really what got me into the AI world. I'm not a technologist. I'm a lawyer, researcher, and activist. And learning more about AI systems has really shown me how systems of power and oppression, as Orem put in, really are perpetuated and exacerbated in the algorithmic world. So let's begin with a brief look at corporate power. And this is really following up on Andrew's excellent presentation. As we see it today, AI design, development, and deployment is primarily done by the private sector, either exclusively or mainly. Corporations and private sector companies really play a fundamental role in these three aspects, which cover all of the life cycle of AI systems. And if you remember, Andrew shared with you a slide kind of zooming out, and it's a large infrastructure. And this is really against the backdrop of neoliberalism and a fast pace of privatizing social services. And we heard some examples of screening tools, access to medicine. We live in a global pandemic right now where increasingly governments are using algorithms to decide who should or should not have access to a vaccine, for example. So if you take in mind our current economic system, primarily neoliberal capitalist environments, and the acceleration of technology, there is an intersection where not only our civil and political rights, such as freedom of expression or privacy, are impacted, but really all of our rights, including economic and social rights. And following up on Orem's excellent presentation and explanation of what colonialism is, we're really entering into an era of digital colonialism, where the majority of these technologies really are designed and developed in the global north, primarily US, Canada, and Western Europe, but they have impacts all over the world. And even though ECNL is a European-based organization, we partner with and support activists globally. And we're really, really thrilled to see some activists from around the world here today. And not to go into deep analysis of how software, hardware, and infrastructure work, but on one side, you have this issue that Andrew said, that everything's developing incredibly quickly, and you don't need many tools to get an AI system. On the other, you see really a handful, 3 or 4 massive corporations, and we all know them: Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, that have most of the hardware, most of the infrastructure needed to actually create massive systems of data collection at a scale that has never been seen before. And this is fundamentally linked to funding as well. We have probably all heard the myth of the brilliant white college boy, Mark Zuckerberg, who came up with an amazing tool, Facebook. But the reality is that the people who have access to funding and VCs often come from upper socioeconomic class, white, usually cis people from the global north, and they have unlimited access to money. Uber and Lyft today are still not profitable and depend on exploiting workers to make a profit or generate resources. And this is all thanks to VC money that not everybody has access to. So just to say that as we think of AI systems, we really need to center corporate power and understand the role of big data within it. And really many of the AI systems we think of today are not necessarily new or emerging technology, but they've been able to scale at such a level thanks to new computing power that is only in the hands of a couple of actors. And this leads me to a lack of transparency. Not to repeat what Andrew said, but the lack of transparency really translates to many different stages of the AI lifecycle. In the design and development side, we really rarely know what data is collected, if it is collected, what data is used for training, if it's validated, then the algorithm and model in of itself, the so-called black box, and then even the output, like even if there is an expressed goal or expected outcome of the system, oftentimes the real hidden expectations and goals of the system are unknown. And these can be either commercial, so profit maximization, or it can be surveillance, control, both on the corporate and the government side. Same for deployment. We rarely know when these systems are deployed, when we are using systems. Sometimes there is information and we can either consent because we really do consent or because we see no alternative means. And other times we are just unaware that we are being subject to an AI systems. And finally, there's very little transparency in governance mechanisms within the actors that use these technologies themselves, be they corporations or governments. We know very little about their due diligence mechanisms, if they conduct any human rights impact assessment, for example, and what, if any, risk management strategies they use and how they define risk. Is it risk to human rights and people, or is it risks to business, operational risks, logistics? So this leads me to one of the main issues that today there is really no accountability. There's no regulation that effectively protects us and our rights. In April, actually, last month was an interesting month, especially in Europe, because the EU dropped a draft regulation on AI. The Council of Europe is also developing a framework, and we see increasing interest in regulating AI. But unfortunately, it's still incredibly insufficient. Most of the time, the burden of proof falls either on the victims or on civil society and activists like many of you here, and digital rights experts to really sound the alarm on some of these oppressive technologies. And unfortunately, corporate lobbying is incredibly fierce. It's expanded anything we've known in the terms of industries or pharma, who have really set the standard high for corporate lobbying. And we've seen many private sector representatives really rush to DC and Brussels as US is thinking about potentially like regulating on a federal level, and the EU as well. So how can we avoid corporate capture at the government level is something that should be really central in our own advocacy efforts as we push back collectively against these systems. So I will end here by saying that this is something that needs urgent and pressing engagement from all of us here. And there's often this misconception and myth that you have to be a technologist or you need to have technical skills, and that the lack of technical skills actually prevents me, you, and us in participating. And I hope that this session today has really busted that myth. And thank you, Orem, for really shining the light on how these systems exist within existing structures of power. One issue, however, that is very true and real, and I wish it were a myth, is how under-resourced we all are. And I understand that with limited time, funding, staff, it's very difficult to participate, especially as you see corporations and governments really increase money in their own capacity in these fields. At the same time, there's this image of techno-solutionism where governments and private sectors tout AI systems by saying that they will solve any social or political problem that exists today, and COVID has definitely accelerated the narrative. And I urge you all to push back against the narrative, asking really, what are the root causes of a problem and what problem are we trying to address? And oftentimes, as Orem has raised, it's not the technology, it really is the system. and then try to unpack the AI system itself and understanding what it aims to do in reality instead of what are the hidden interests. And I'll finish my presentation by just highlighting corporate capture in civil society as well, as there has been more pressure on companies to actually include communities in the design and development of their technologies. There's also been a sort of human rights washing where really we include communities, but in a way that co-opts our ideas, our values, our concerns, puts a human rights approved stamp on the technology, and really doesn't meaningfully incorporate our concerns in no way. So in this case, in any type of multi-stakeholder participation, we really have to push for distributed and collective decision-making power. We want to have control over the technology and its deployment, and really play a key role in accountability, both at the corporate level and in the governments in policymaking. And we've seen now with both at the EU and UN levels, for example, most of the times when policymakers talk about including experts, and I use experts with quotation marks, they often think about industry representatives or academics, and really leaving out the groups and communities that are already underrepresented, already disproportionately at risk, and who are disproportionately impacted by these systems. So on that note, I will give it back to Vanya and encourage us all here to participate and make our voices heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, Ora, Marlena. You were absolutely amazing. At one point, drove the tears to my eyes. I really hope that, if there is only one message everyone here can take away today, it's exactly that. We don't need to be tech experts in order to have a right to participate in discussions around how this technology impacts our work, our life, our rights, our freedoms. So that's really something we need to constantly repeat to ourselves and embed in our work, and request and demand not only resources, but also place at the table. I'll open the floor now to any of the questions. Feel free to unmute yourself, present yourself to the camera, or if you don't want to do that, you can put your question in the chat. We have enough time for Q&A, and then we'll break out in smaller groups to discuss some of these topics in more detail. Who wants to break the ice to pose the first question? Don't be shy. As we mentioned, we are actual experts here, and we don't have to have technological background to discuss these topics. Before we get our, we have a hands up. Please unmute yourself and start the question.
Yes,
Sophia.
I guess I'll go. Yes.
Go ahead.
Let me put the video. Hi. So I have a question for, oh no, I forgot your name. I'm sorry. I'm on my phone so I can see everyone. Let's see.
Don't worry, just ask a question.
Andrew, there we go.
We'll try to, okay.
Yes. So just a really simple short question. When you talked about color coding, the system of color coding in like that in airports, and actually that made me realize and remember that so I've traveled a lot in the US, and they put a little sticker, like a color sticker on passports. Is that what you were referring to, for example?
Good question. Yeah. So that actually wasn't what I was referring to, but I also have seen that sticker in US airports. I'm not quite sure. No, this is actually a UK Home Office system that they were running, and it was basically using like a traffic light system on the back end, so not anything that would be visible to you.
Okay.
Green meant that your visa was definitely approved. Yellow meant there would be some extra review, and red basically meant that there was a very, very low likelihood your visa would be approved. And the algorithm they were using essentially was, if you were from a list of certain nationalities like Iranian or Jordanian, it would immediately list you as red. No other evaluation about your criteria. And it's, again, just a great example of like those horrible ways, which are very complex, opaque process that like you've no insight or ability to contest very easily, is made all the more opaque by the addition of an algorithm where even home office agents couldn't explain to you why it was giving certain decisions. They were just going off of the output they would see. But yeah, I've always wondered what that weird sticker thing is in the States. I that's probably one for us to both look up to see what that's about.
Yeah, I was like, oh, I don't know what it is. Thank you.
Thank you for your question and answer. We also have one question in chat, so I will read it out for our speakers, whoever wants to answer. Is there any technologies other than machine learning for AI implications in democracy? Can you think of some examples?
I can start. One that is not completely separate from machine learning is the issue of surveillance. The reason why they're connected, as Andrew mentioned, the amount of data that is being collected is at a scale of no other in human history. And in order to process that data, make predictions and assessments of people, us, based on that data, we need algorithms to do that processing. I think Marlena could probably talk more about surveillance. I know a little history, but I'm not like too experienced in surveillance. So I'll pass it to Marlena or Andrew.
Sure. I mean, surveillance is an entire topic in itself, and actually we'll have our own session on surveillance. So I won't go into huge detail, and most of the issues that we're most preoccupied with right now actually in surveillance are machine learning based, and that's facial recognition, which is computer vision. And it's more the scale than the system in and of itself, and the fact that there is just so little transparency and accountability in way to control them. In terms of what types of technologies, so I myself am not a technologist. I learned from my peers and people like Orem here. Deepfakes is a huge issue for democracy as well, and it's not a machine learning system. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Orem or Andrew, right? Andrew, actually, you're a technologist as well, right? So I'm not best equipped to answer this question.
No, I think these are very good points raised. I think there are very complex systems that machine learning would be one type or field of AI where you have very complex systems. But the majority of horrible algorithms and AI systems that I come across and Ada comes across in our day-to-day job are very simple. They're something as simple as a linear regression model, which is just if you have variable A and variable B. If you have A and B, then you're out. If you have only A, then you're in. To give a great example of this, the off-qual algorithm, which was a grading algorithm used in the UK to predict students' grades. That was not any fancy system. It was a very simple model that just looked at historic grades from a school district, and this teacher predicted grades and just combined the two and averaged them out, essentially. And to get even more low tech, a shocking amount of quite bad AI decisions are just from spreadsheets, just tracking data, and data gets lost or gets cut or someone can't find a particular piece of information. Those are very simple forms of data management that can ultimately lead to really harmful outcomes. And again, very hard to identify those. So it's kind of the point that I think Orem and myself and Marlena all raised about this point where the type of system, like how rich or how technical it is far less important than where it is being integrated and what its impacts are. And if you're talking with someone who's falling back on technical details to justify their use of a system, that's a huge red flag. If they can't tell you how this impacts you or impacts your constituents, that is a sign that something really sketchy is going on. So yeah, it's a good question, but I think the impacts piece, I think, is the most important thing to focus on.
Thank you, Andrew. We have a raised hand from Benjamin, so go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ben. I'm from the Roma Initiatives Office. I would like to ask a question for everyone. So we know now about the implications, the threats of AI on human rights. Do you know of any examples how these technologies have been used for the advancement of human rights? Like maybe in research or advocacy, or maybe using the same kind of technologies for creating a counter narrative or something.
Who wants to take that?
I don't know too many examples of advancing human rights through specific products or technologies that were released. I'm sure they exist. They're just not on my radar. But I don't think all use of technology is inherently bad. I think technology is neutral because it is a tool. A lot of algorithms are assistive. So aside from the example that I think Andrew, or I forget if it was Andrew or Marlena raised, of algorithms being biased in the medical system, it could be assistive in the context of diagnosis. So automating a process of combining symptoms in order to suggest a diagnosis and treatment. And then there's also the case of automating how we perceive and process information. I know Google has a lot of criticisms that are rooted in truth, but it does automate the process of going to a librarian. So initially we would go to the library and ask the librarian a question, and it was the librarian's job to turn our question into the information we needed. And that has been fully automated by Google. It opened up some branches to exploring ourselves and knowledge in general, but it's still immersed in those systems. So I wouldn't say it's advancing human rights fully.
Thanks a lot.
And connected also to the question in the chat on on technical solutionism. So on the positive sides, I mean, first, like as a caveat, every time I think about a positive side, it's more hypothetical than what is happening today in practice, because given our presentations and the systems in which we live in, these systems always get co-opted, right? So technically, content moderation, theoretically, content moderation could be a tool to advance human rights as we're screening for hate speech, discriminatory content, inflammatory content, incitement to violence. And we need, in reality, we really do need these tools, because it's impossible to do that with a handful of people. And even if we're talking about thousands of people, it's still a handful given the millions of posts that are online today, right? The reality is that given how these systems are created by social media platforms, there's no understanding of local context. Like Andrew said, there's insufficient capacity in terms of languages, especially indigenous languages and minorities. Roma, as you well know, are always underrepresented in data sets, and the context is never understood, let alone even considered, right? Most people don't even think about the most vulnerable groups. So even as there's more visibility today about some groups, especially women and people of color, there's still a very binary to gender, for example. So a lot of exclusion of trans women, gender nonconforming persons. And then how do you define a person of color? Who gets to define that? And the reality is that oftentimes there's tech about people without the people. And this brings me to the tech for good or development. There shouldn't be no tech for Africans without involving Africans, no tech for Roma people without having decision-making by Roma people. But the reality is that the actors, I'd say, who design, develop, and deploy these tools are not minorities for all the other reasons we mentioned before, right? and not even minorities, just affected users. So I think that to the person who asked about being anti-development, I always push back by saying, one, what is the root cause that we're trying to address? And oftentimes, if we peel a little bit below the layers, the AI system does not address the root cause, right? If we're thinking about risk assessment tools for criminal justice, we should really either abolish the carceral system or stop putting people in cages. It's not by having an algorithmic system that we will somehow fix the carceral system. So that is one. What is the root cause? Is the system, AI system, really addressing the cause, the problem, or is it a solution to another issue? And number two, how does this impact disproportionately affected communities who are often excluded, right? So if we take a sort of neutral analysis of an AI system, and we take even like, Andrew or myself, any of people on this call, there's always some type of privilege, especially if you're upper socioeconomic class. Class usually often gets forgotten from these systems as well. Not to go full on Marxist on screen, but all this to say that the systems works for a majority, but they often forget people who already are underrepresented and vulnerable. And so any AI system that tends to solve development as a problem has to include these people.
Thank you, Merlena. We have a hand raised from Mer Jacobian. So please go ahead and mute yourself and ask a question.
Hello, yes. Actually, I just wanted to comment mainly and also kind of answer the question about the positive aspects of AI. Just to say, emerging technologies in general, I represent the European Disability Forum, and our motto is actually nothing about us without us. So I agree with the point made that, people affected by these technologies should be involved in the development of the technologies themselves, and also in the legal frameworks and the policy frameworks in a very meaningful way. And I share a lot of the points that the speakers made. It was very interesting to hear. I think for persons with disabilities, there is kind of a double side, like all of the harm and risks that you mentioned. Of course, we also note, and there we will engage with the negotiation process of the regulation to also advocate to reduce the harms that we see now potentially, but also in terms of developing accessibility, emerging technologies can be useful and they have been useful. And I think the point is for us to highlight how through the regulation, this aspect can actually be strengthened, because it talks a lot about the good use of AI and how it can promote, more equality and advancement of human rights. But in reality, there is very little in the regulation that would promote this. I think it just assumes that new technologies will bring positive change by themselves, but we cannot achieve that if all of the points that you've already mentioned that are not considered. So I think that's my main point for now. But I would also, I would like to really comment also Arum's approach of the providing audio description of the setting before starting the presentation. This is also for persons with disabilities are really important. So thank you for that. I look forward to further discussion. So thanks.
Thank you so much. And there is also an answer in the chat from Andrew about the question, more optimistic one, or partially optimistic overview of, are there any promising models for continuous approach to human rights auditing? So if, Andrew, you could just share in literally 10 words before we wrap up this public part, what your vision of the future is. Is it optimistic or pessimistic?
Oh God, it's hard to do in 10 words. I think there's emerging methods that are fill me with hope, and I think part of that is about instilling a different culture of technology development that has existed before, and the way to enforce that or to instill that is to have consequences for bad uses of technology. So, having worked in industry for a very long time, if there are reputational harms that come with particular practices, if there are regulatory implications for particular practices, if there are ways that you can force developers who would normally have no incentive to think about the implications of their work to do so, that to me feels like the most compelling way to achieve that. And I think we're seeing right now a really wonderful moment where many people within the AI research and development community are already pushing that mantle forward. And we're also seeing like the EU AI draft regulation attempts to enshrine that kind of duty of care mentality in law to create those meaningful consequences that Marlena talked about. I don't want to say that the draft regulation is perfect, but I do think it seems like a good step in the right direction. And last, I just want to big up Mayor's comment about the use of AI and other forms of technology for accessibility purposes. That's a great example of how these systems can be beneficial. I don't want to give the idea that these are harmful inherently systems. No technology, as Sorma said, is inherently good or bad or neutral. It's how we use them. And that notion of creating a duty of care, that obligation to think about the impacts, is perhaps how we move forward to a more thoughtful and rights respecting, impact minded way of developing technology.
Thank you. I think also that's a good answer to the question of how do we fight this narrative of being anti-development. We can also use some of these arguments as well. With that in mind, we'll finish this first part, and thank you everyone for watching us on live stream. We'll continue our discussion in smaller groups based on different topics, and I'll invite our